Mara Ellis planned to spend one weekend at the lakeside cottage, maybe two if the plumbing argued, and then she would hand the keys to a rental manager. That was before Biscuit dug his nose into a cracked mudroom wall, pulled out an envelope yellowed by years, and carried it to the porch like he had been sent on an errand. Mara thought it was a mouse nest at first. Then she saw the handwriting. Please ask June if the lentil soup can feed 12 without looking poor. Under the porch rail, half hidden by peeling paint, someone had carved 12 names. The cottage sat at the quiet end of Lake Maribel, where the road narrowed to one lane and mailboxes leaned in pairs beneath maple branches. Mara had inherited it from a great-aunt she knew mostly through holiday cards and precise recipes written in blue ink. In the Navy, Mara had cooked in busy galleys where a late meal could ruin a day and a calm meal could settle a whole crew. She respected timing, portions, clean counters, and the ordinary mercy of hot food arriving when people needed it. After retiring, she wanted a smaller rhythm. The cottage looked like a sensible rental, and sensible was what she had promised herself. Biscuit disagreed within 10 minutes. He was a sturdy brown dog with white paws, a soft face, and a belief that every closed cabinet contained either a snack or a clue. He sniffed the front room, approved the rug, ignored the view, and wedged himself into the mudroom where beadboard had split near the floor. Mara told him to leave it. Biscuit backed out with an envelope held gently between his teeth. It was not chewed. It was delivered. He trotted past the kitchen, crossed the sagging porch boards, and dropped it beneath the rail where the carved names waited. Mara read the letter twice before she moved. It was not a love note, a bill, or a family secret dressed up in drama. It was a request for soup. The writer needed a pot that could stretch, taste good the next day, and leave enough money for bus fare. At the bottom, in different handwriting, someone had added lentils, onion, carrot, bay leaf. Make bread if flour allows. Ask Ruth about the stove that runs hot. Mara looked back at the mudroom wall. Biscuit looked too, tail moving slowly, as if the wall had more to say. By noon, he had found 6 envelopes. One held a recipe for chicken and rice without the chicken, because the writer had crossed it out and substituted mushrooms. One held instructions for repairing a loose chair rung with twine and glue. Another explained how to divide a weekly paycheck into jars marked rent, groceries, light bill, savings, and spare. The last was a thank you card with no last name only. I sat under Alma's name and left knowing how to make supper, without burning my courage. Mara set that card down carefully. The cottage was no longer a rental project. It was a question. The porch names were harder to read. Paint had filled some grooves. Weather had softened others. Mara rubbed them with a cloth and copied each one into her notebook. June, Alma, Ruth, Celia, May, Lottie, Grace, Vivian, Pearl, Nora, Tess, and Ellis. The last made her pause. Ellis was her surname, but carved names did not have to mean family. Biscuit sniffed the rail beneath Ellis, sneezed from dust, and sat down. Mara checked the envelope stack again. None were addressed to Ellis. That absence bothered her more than a direct message would have. She spent the first night in a chair by the kitchen window, reading letters while the lake turned black and silver beyond the screens. The requests were plain and exact. How do I make beans taste different by Wednesday? Can a hem be fixed without a sewing machine? What do I say when the bank asks for records I do not have? How many eggs for 6 people if 2 are saving lunch for work? Each answer was practical, never flowery, and often written by a different hand. The cottage had not belonged to one generous aunt. It had held a network. The next morning, Mara found the pantry shelves labeled in the same blue ink as the letters. Not labels for food, exactly. Labels for problems. Shelf 1 read stretch. Shelf 2 read start over. Shelf 3 read bring something. Shelf 4 read borrow and return. Behind jars of dried beans and a tin of baking powder, Biscuit nosed out a ledger wrapped in an apron. The cover said Sunday supper, but the pages did not list guests in the usual way. They listed names, skills offered, skills needed, and what each person promised to practice before the next meal. Mara should have felt pleased. A charming history made a rental more interesting. She could frame a few recipes, write a tasteful listing, maybe call it the Sunday Supper Cottage. Instead, the idea made her push the ledger away. The letters were too intimate for decoration, not because they exposed scandal, but because they recorded people at the fragile moment when pride and need stand close together. Whoever carved those porch names had known how to help without making help feel like a spotlight. Biscuit kept returning to the rail. He would sniff one carved name, circle to the mudroom wall, and tap the cracked beadboard with one paw. Mara began to follow the pattern. June connected to soup recipes. Alma connected to budgeting jars. Ruth connected to stove repairs. Celia connected to sewing. May connected to pantry rotation. Each name was not simply a person, it was a station, like a kitchen version of a chart. The cottage taught through supper, but supper was only the doorway. In town, the first person Mara asked was the hardware clerk, a woman with silver hair pinned under a cap that read Marable Supply. Mara showed her a recipe card with Ruth's name. The clerk took off her glasses and smiled in a way that made her look both happy and cautious. Ruth could make a stove behave by listening to it, she said. Then she asked where Mara had found the card. When Mara told her, the smile changed. People thought those letters were sealed up for good. Nobody said why. Nobody ever said why first. The clerk's name was Celia, and she was younger than the carved Celia, a niece. She remembered Sunday suppers as a sound more than an event. Chairs scraping, women and men laughing low, the porch door opening again and again, someone calling out measurements from the kitchen. The suppers were not for show. A person came with one thing they could teach and one thing they needed to learn. If they had no skill to offer yet, they helped wash dishes and came back next week. That was enough to begin. Celia sent Mara to the library, where the old community bulletins were stored in flat boxes. Biscuit was allowed inside because the librarian had known Mara's aunt and because Biscuit sat with the solemn posture of a dog who understood paper mattered. They found no advertisement for Sunday supper, no flyer, no announcement, only tiny notices placed between quilting club updates and late cleanup days. Recipe exchange, porch side, bring a question. Budget jars, porch side, bring 3 labels. Chair mending, porch side, bring patience. The public face was small enough to miss. The private work was large enough to change lives. The deeper Mara looked, the more the cottage resisted becoming cute. The recipe letters were not quaint. They were field notes from people learning how to keep a week from tipping over. One card explained how to make a work lunch that would not leak in a bag. Another described how to patch a window screen before insects turned the kitchen into a losing negotiation. Another listed 3 polite ways to ask for payment without apologizing for needing it. Mara recognized the tone. It was the tone of a good galley checklist. Clear, calm, and written by someone who had made this mistake already so the next person would not have to. On the 3rd day, a rental photographer arrived early, sent by the manager before Mara had canceled anything. He liked the lake light, the old table, the porch rail. He suggested sanding the names down because carved names could make guests feel the cottage was too personal. Mara looked at the rail. Biscuit stood between the photographer and the porch, not growling, not causing a scene, simply present with all 4 paws set. Mara thanked the photographer and said she was not ready. After he left, she called the rental manager and paused the listing. That pause opened the next question. If the names mattered, why had they been hidden under paint? If the letters mattered, why seal them inside a wall? Mara found the answer in the mudroom, but not right away. Biscuit had widened the cracked beadboard enough for her to see a narrow cavity behind it. Inside were envelopes sorted by ribbon color. Blue meant recipes, green meant repairs, brown meant money habits, red meant table seats. The red ribbon bundle held a seating chart drawn like a ship's mess plan, efficient and exact. Mara smiled despite herself. Her aunt had thought like a cook responsible for morale. The red bundle explained the porch names. Each carved name corresponded to a seat at the long table, and each seat carried a responsibility. June sat nearest the stove and watched timing. Alma sat by the pantry and checked portions. Ruth sat near the back door where tools were kept. Ellis sat at the end of the porch, not because Ellis was the host, but because Ellis welcomed late arrivals. The name was not a family signature, it was a role. Mara's surname had been waiting under paint, because someone in her line had once been trusted to make room for whoever came last. She took that discovery to the lake instead of town. Biscuit followed, splashing only up to his ankles before deciding the shore was more dignified. Mara sat on a flat rock and thought about all the meals she had made in noisy rooms far from this cottage. She had fed people on schedules, through long days, during relocations, inspections, and celebrations. She knew food could hold a group steady without saying a sentimental word. Yet after retiring, she had avoided cooking for anyone but herself, because she was tired of being useful on demand. The cottage was asking a different question. Could usefulness be chosen instead of demanded? That evening, Celia came by with a box of old measuring cups. She claimed she was clearing space at the store, but the cups were polished, nested, and tied with string. Behind her came the librarian with copied bulletins. Then a man named Victor who owned the diner and remembered his uncle learning pie crust on that porch. Nobody called it a meeting. They stood in the kitchen, touching the table, reading the labels and telling Mara small things. The suppers had helped people learn enough cooking to stretch paychecks, enough budgeting to sleep easier, enough repairs to keep homes working, and enough confidence to ask one decent question at a time. Victor remembered the Last Supper. Not because something awful happened. It was quieter than that. Mara's aunt had moved to be nearer medical care, the regular teachers had spread into other obligations, and the cottage passed into seasonal use. Everyone assumed someone else would restart it. Then the wall was closed during a mudroom repair, the rail was painted, and the habit dissolved. That was the strange ache of the story. A good thing had not ended in a dramatic scene. It had ended because no one put the chairs out the following Sunday. Mara slept badly after that, not from fear, but from arithmetic. A rental would bring income. A supper would bring dishes, scheduling, repairs, and the tender awkwardness of people arriving with questions they had rehearsed in their cars. She made coffee before sunrise and found Biscuit already sitting under the porch rail beneath Ellis. He had placed one envelope between his paws. It was the thank you card about making supper without burning courage. On the back, in her aunt's blue ink, someone had written, "The next Ellis will know the difference between feeding people and filling a room." That line found Mara exactly where she lived. Feeding people was not the same as performing abundance. It was not about a table so full that everyone admired the host. It was about the right meal at the right time, with instructions clear enough that a person could repeat it alone later. In the galley, she had learned that a calm cook could change the pace of a whole day. At the cottage, her aunt had used the same truth to teach neighbors how to carry skills back into their own kitchens, budgets, and tool drawers. Mara did not reopen Sunday supper with an announcement. She began by testing the stove, sharpening knives, washing the porch rail, and copying the safest recipes into a new notebook. Celia brought pantry labels. Victor brought plain chairs from the diner basement. The librarian made a sign-up sheet with only first names and 2 columns. Can share, want to learn. Biscuit supervised from the mudroom, where he continued to find envelopes whenever Mara thought the wall had finally given up all its secrets. The first modern supper nearly failed before it began because Mara cooked too much. Old habit. She had prepared as if feeding a crew after a long workday, and the table looked generous in the wrong way. Too impressive. Too easy for a nervous person to feel they had nothing equal to bring. She stood there frowning until Celia quietly removed 2 casseroles, packed them for later, and set out lentil soup, bread, salad, and apples. Simple food, repeatable food. Food that did not make the room feel like a test. 6 people came, then 3 more. One brought a broken drawer pull and sat near Ruth's old place. One brought a stack of unopened mail and chose Alma's seat. One came only to learn a soup that could become lunch twice without tasting tired. Mara did not ask anyone to introduce themselves beyond first names. She explained the cottage rule. Everyone would leave with one thing to practice and one thing they could offer next time, even if the offer was washing bowls, labeling jars, or reminding someone to turn off the burner under the rice. Biscuit performed his role without instruction. He lay beside the person who spoke least, then moved when that person finally asked a question. He nudged a dropped pencil back under the table. He sat beneath Ellis when a late arrival hesitated at the screen door, giving Mara just enough warning to make room without turning the arrival into an event. By dessert, the room had loosened, not loudly, just enough. Chairs shifted closer. Someone asked for the bread recipe. Someone else admitted she knew how to fix a sticking cabinet if anyone wanted to learn after supper. The next week, Mara added skill cards to the pantry shelves. Not fancy cards, just plain index cards with 1 task each. Make soup from what is left. Read a utility bill without panic. Patch a screen. Plan 3 breakfasts. Sew a button. Clean a stove safely. Ask a landlord for a repair in writing. Keep receipts in a shoebox until a better system exists. She used direct language because direct language respects people. Vague encouragement can feel kind for a minute, but a clear instruction can be carried home. As the suppers grew, Mara guarded the cottage from becoming a spectacle. A local paper wanted to write about the hidden letters. She declined. A lakeside shop asked if she would sell framed recipe prints. She declined that too. The letters stayed in acid-free sleeves at the library, copied only for those who needed the instructions. The porch names remained carved, not branded. Mara understood now why the wall had held the envelopes so long. Some histories are not meant to be displayed. They are meant to be continued with care. 1 month after Biscuit found the first envelope, Mara opened a final bundle from the mudroom wall. It had been tucked higher than the rest, behind a narrow strip of trim. The ribbon was white cotton, stained with age. Inside was a menu for the first Sunday supper ever held at the cottage. Bean soup, skillet bread, pickled carrots, apple cake if enough sugar remained. Beneath it was a list of names: June, Alma, Ruth, Celia, May, Lottie, Grace, Vivian, Pearl, Nora, Tess, Ellis. Each name had a sentence beside it. Ellis keeps the porch light low so latecomers can enter without feeling watched. Mara changed the porch bulb that afternoon. The old one was too bright, glaring against the screens. She replaced it with a warm lamp that lit the steps but not the whole yard. It was a small choice, almost invisible, which meant it was exactly the kind of choice the cottage understood. That evening, a woman arrived late with a jar of coins and a question about grocery money. She paused at the screen door, saw Mara looking down at a recipe instead of watching her, and stepped inside. The earned reveal was not that the cottage had once helped people. Mara had learned that early. The deeper reveal was that the help had been designed to travel. A person learned soup, then taught soup. A person learned a budget jar, then helped someone label 3 jars. A person learned to mend a chair, then brought twine next Sunday. The porch names were not memorials. They were jobs still waiting to be done by whoever had the patience to sit in the old seat and make the next instruction plain. By autumn, the rental plan had become a folder in a drawer. Mara did not throw it away. She liked practical options too much for grand gestures. But the cottage calendar filled with Sunday suppers, Tuesday repair practice, Thursday budget tea, and one quiet Monday each month when no one cooked and people only copied recipes in the slow afternoon light. The lake changed color. The maples thinned. Biscuit grew famous for finding whichever envelope Mara needed before she knew she needed it, though she suspected he mostly followed the scent of old paper and butter. On the last warm Sunday of the season, Mara served the lentil soup from the first letter. She made it exactly as written, with onion, carrot, bay leaf, and enough bread for everyone to take some home. Before supper, she stood on the porch and ran her fingers over the carved Ellis. It no longer felt like a coincidence or a burden. It felt like a place at the table. Behind her, Biscuit settled under the rail, his nose pointed toward the mudroom wall, always ready for one more message. Mara looked through the screen at the people gathering around the long table. A drawer pull waited beside a bowl. 3 jars stood ready for labels. Someone had brought a bag of apples and a question about freezing soup. The room smelled of bread and lake air, soap and old wood, paper and pencil. Nothing about it looked dramatic. That was the beauty of it. The cottage had not been hiding treasure. It had been keeping recipes for courage, written in measurements ordinary people could repeat. When Mara finally sat in the Ellis place, the late chair at the end of the porch, she understood why Biscuit had carried the first letter there. The names were not asking to be admired. They were asking to be read aloud through action. Feed a person in a way they can feed themselves later. Teach one useful thing. Learn one useful thing. Leave the porch light low. And when a dog brings an old envelope to your feet, pay attention. Sometimes a wall cracks because a house is ready to serve supper again. The suppers did not become easy simply because Mara understood them. Understanding created responsibility, and responsibility created dishes. After the 3rd Sunday, the sink clogged. 2 people brought the same question. The oven ran too hot on one side, and Biscuit stole a carrot from the prep bowl with the solemn expression of dog conducting quality control. Mara almost laughed, then almost snapped, then remembered the old seating chart. The cottage had never promised a smooth table. It promised a repeatable one. A repeatable supper could survive a clogged sink, a hot oven, and one missing carrot. She began building systems the way she once built galley routines. Knives on the left, boards on the right, soup pot filled before guests arrived, repair tools in a crate under Ruth's seat, budget jars on the pantry shelf with blank label facing forward. The old cottage rhythm returned only when the physical room made the desired behavior easy. If people had to ask where pencils were, they felt exposed. If pencils waited in a mug near the ledger cards, they used them. If a recipe required ingredients no one kept at home, Mara rewrote it. Fancy instructions had no place on that porch. Biscuit found another cavity behind the pantry shelves in early winter. He scratched once, then looked at Mara, having learned that scratching twice earned a lecture about old wood. Behind a loose trim strip was a folded oilcloth packet marked 3 rules for supper. Mara expected something sentimental. Instead, the rules were blunt. Bring 1 question. Take 1 instruction you can repeat. Teach 1 thing within a month, even if you teach it to the person beside you. At the bottom, in the same blue ink, someone had added, if the table becomes impressive, make simpler soup. Mara copied that last line and taped it inside the cupboard. It saved her from herself more than once. When Victor offered to donate elaborate desserts from the diner, she accepted apples instead and asked him to teach pie dough on a separate afternoon. When Celia brought a glossy binder for repair classes, Mara thanked her and replaced it with single cards. When the librarian suggested a registration form, Mara asked whether first names and a phone number would do. The cottage worked best when no one felt they had joined an institution by asking how to stretch rice. The porch names gained new meaning as people used them. June was no longer only a carved word. June meant timing, tasting, and the discipline of starting bread early enough for it to cool before slicing. Alma meant jars, bills, and the mercy of writing amounts in pencil first. Ruth meant stove sounds, loose handles, and the difference between a repair that holds and one that only looks fixed. Ellis meant the late chair, the low light, and the host's job of looking busy enough that someone could enter without feeling watched. One night, an older woman named Lottie arrived with a cloth bag of measuring spoons. Mara recognized the name from the rail and tried not to stare. This Lottie was the niece of the carved Lottie, and she carried herself like someone who had corrected many recipes and a few mayors. She sat in her aunt's old place and let the room go quiet before speaking. The suppers were never for rescuing people, she said. They were for trading what a person had learned the hard way before the next person had to learn it alone. Mara wrote that sentence on a card and placed it near the sign-up sheet. Lottie also corrected the budget jar lesson. Mara had been teaching 4 jars because it was tidy. Lottie said the old porch used 3 for beginners: must pay, must eat, must save for the next surprise. 4 could come later. Too many jars made people feel behind before they began. Mara adjusted the lesson that night. The change seemed small until she watched the next group relax, when 3 jars appeared instead of a row of labeled glass that looked like a test. The cottage cared about the number of steps between confusion and action. The letters kept yielding practical wisdom. One explained how to plan a week's meals from a single base pot without making every day taste like punishment. Start with beans and onions. Add tomatoes on Tuesday. Mash some for patties on Wednesday, thin with broth on Thursday. Freeze 1 jar before you are tired of it. Another letter taught the 3-question repair rule. Is it loose, stuck, or missing? Loose gets tightened. Stuck gets cleaned. Missing gets matched before you buy. Mara admired the rule so much she used it on the cottage itself. She applied it to the supper program too. Loose meant volunteers drifting from their roles, so she tightened the seating chart. Stuck meant a person returning with the same question but too much embarrassment to say so she added practice nights. Missing meant a skill the table did not yet have, so she asked quietly until someone knew it. That was how a retired sistress began teaching hymns. A bank teller began explaining statements, and Victor admitted he could teach kitchen tool care if Mara stopped pretending his diner tools maintained themselves. As winter settled over Lake Marable, the suppers moved earlier. Darkness came fast, and the porch light did its careful work. Mara kept it low, as the Ellis instruction required, but she added a second lamp in the mudroom so people could find coat hooks without fumbling. She learned that dignity lived in such details: a clear path, a warm bowl, a pencil that wrote, a dog who greeted everyone the same way whether they arrived with a casserole, a question, or both hands empty. Biscuit became especially devoted to the late arrivals. At 7:15, he would leave his kitchen rug and settle under the Ellis chair, nose pointed toward the door. Mara stopped questioning it. 10 minutes later, someone usually appeared. One woman brought a sealed envelope from the utility company and a jar of peach jam she clearly hoped would count as confidence. A man brought no object at all, only a question about making food for one without wasting half of it. Biscuit leaned against his boot until he sat. Mara served soup and let the table do the rest. The cottage also required boundaries. After a neighbor posted a cheerful note online, 2 strangers arrived wanting to film the hidden letters. Mara declined before they finished asking. She offered them soup to go and said the letters were working documents, not props. The decision cost her a possible donation. It gained her the trust of 3 people who had been sitting close enough to hear. The next week, one of them brought a box of spare notebooks and said she liked that the cottage did not turn private effort into entertainment. Mara's Old Navy habits helped more than she expected, but only after she softened their edges. She knew inventory, portions, timing, cleaning, and how to keep a busy room from tangling itself. What she had to relearn was permission. In the galley, people ate because the schedule said so. At the cottage, people learned because they chose to sit down. She could not command that. She could only make the table ready, the instructions clear, and the welcome quiet enough for choice to survive. In February, the stove finally demanded attention beyond Ruth's old notes. It heated unevenly, snapped at odd moments, and turned one batch of bread pale on the left while browning the right too fast. Mara could have bought a new stove with 3 calls and a dent in her savings. Instead, she used the repair rule: loose, stuck, or missing. Celia helped remove the panel. Victor cleaned the burner assembly. Lottie identified a missing spacer from a coffee tin of old parts. The stove returned to steady work by supper, and everyone who helped understood it better. That repair became the template for a new Thursday practice called Fix What Feeds You. It covered stoves, pantry shelves, table legs, lunchboxes, thermos lids, can openers, dull knives, and the kind of drawer that jams exactly when patience is thinnest. The name sounded almost grand, so Mara nearly rejected it. Lottie approved because it was specific. Fix what feeds you, not everything, not the whole house. Begin with the object that helps you eat, cook, carry, or share. Spring brought more people and the risk of losing the cottage's shape. Mara capped each supper at 12 because 12 names were carved on the rail. When more wanted to come, she added another night rather than squeezing chairs. Space was part of the instruction. She trained hosts for each named seat, but training meant doing the task together 3 times, not receiving a title. Biscuit attended all training sessions, unless rain made the mudroom smell interesting, in which case his commitment weakened. The most important training was Ellis. Mara expected that role to be simple. Keep the porch light low, welcome late arrivals, make room. It was not simple. The Ellis host had to notice without staring, help without fussing, and remember that late did not always mean careless. Sometimes late meant a bus schedule, a shift, a hard phone call, or 10 minutes in the car gathering courage. Mara practiced by asking trusted regulars to arrive at awkward times. The first time, she overdid the welcome. The second time, she barely looked up and felt rude. The third time, she found the balance. One of the old letters explained it better than any training. A late person needs proof the room can absorb them. Do not stop the room, widen it. Mara read that line before every supper for a month. It changed how she moved. When the screen door opened late, she shifted a chair with her foot, kept stirring, and said, bowl on the counter, spoon by the plates. It gave the arrival a task instead of an entrance. The room widened. Biscuit naturally believed this was all his idea. The earned reveal of the porch names deepened when Mara began tracking who taught next. A person who learned budget jars in January taught a neighbor in March. A person who learned soup in February brought 3 recipe cards in April. A person who came in quiet for 6 weeks became the best teacher of lunch planning because she remembered exactly which instructions had felt too fast. The old rule worked. Take 1 instruction you can repeat. Teach 1 thing within a month. The cottage did not create experts. It created carriers. By summer, Mara realized she had stopped describing herself as retired when people asked what she did. She said she kept the Sunday table. That answer surprised her the first time it came out, but it fit. Keeping the table was not the same as running everything. A kept table had room for other hands. It expected use. It held scratches from repair lessons, flour in the seams, pencil marks near Alma's place, and 1 faint paw print in old varnish where Biscuit had once investigated a cooling pie too closely. The final packet Biscuit found was not in the wall. Wistful, it was under the porch step, inside a tin box wedged between joists. Short pause, matter of fact. He discovered it during a thunderous afternoon rain that made the lake vanish behind silver sheets. Calm Mara was checking for leaks when Biscuit lay flat, reached 1 paw under the step, and dragged the box forward by its handle. Short Paw's curious inside were blank cards, 12 of them, 1 for each porch name. Paw's wistful across the top, her aunt had written, for the next people who think they arrived with nothing to offer. Short Paw's, matter of fact, each blank card had a prompt. Calm, I can show someone how to. Calm, I learned this after making it too hard once. Calm, I know where to find. Calm, I can sit with someone while they try. Mara spread the cards on the kitchen table and felt the cottage's deepest lessons settle into place. Short Pause, matter of fact, the suppers had never divided people into helpers and helped. Calm, everyone moved through both roles. Calm, a person might need a budget jar and know how to sharpen scissors. Calm, a person might need a soup recipe and know how to write a calm email. Short Pause, matter of fact. The table's job was to reveal the exchange. Pause, calm, at the anniversary supper, Mara placed the blank cards beside the bowls. Short Pause, matter of fact, she did not make a speech. Calm. She said anyone who wanted could fill one out before leaving. Short pause. By the end of the night, all 12 cards were written. Calm Biscuit slept under Ellis while Mara read them after the dishes were done. Short pause, matter of fact. The offers were modest and exact. Patch a screen, compare grocery prices, read a lease slowly, make rice that does not clump, plan bus errands, clean a coffee maker, ask for a payment plan, sew on a button, organize a receipt box, write a simple menu, sit during a first phone call, keep the porch light low. Pause. Calm. Mara added those cards to a new rail box and left the old letters in their sleeves. Short pause. The cottage was no longer only preserving a past kindness. It was producing new instructions in the same plain hand, one Sunday at a time. Wistful, she had thought inheritance meant deciding what to keep and what to sell. Short pause. Now she knew it could mean learning the use of a thing before assigning it a value. Pause. Matter of fact. The lake cottage was worth more than a rental rate, but not because it was charming. It was worth more because people left knowing how to do one practical thing they could teach again. Pause. Calm. Late that night, after everyone had gone, Mara sat in the Ellis chair with Biscuit's head on her shoe. Calm. The porch light glowed low over the steps. Wistful. The names under the rail no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. They felt like a roster for tomorrow's work. Short pause. Calm. In the kitchen, soup cooled in labeled jars. Calm. On the table, a pencil waited beside blank cards. Short pause. Matter of fact. The cracked mudroom wall had been repaired, but Mara left one small panel removable. Calm. Biscuit deserved access to future history, and Mara had learned not to argue when the cottage chose a dog as its messenger. Pause. Matter of fact. The first full year of suppers taught Mara that a table can become too central if every question has to travel to one address. People began asking whether the cottage could host extra nights, extra lessons, extra groups, extra everything. Short pause. Tense. Mara recognized the danger before she had words for it. Matter of fact. A good table can accidentally make people wait for permission. Short pause. Calm. The old letters had been designed to travel, so the new work had to travel too. Matter of fact. She created porch packets, 5 recipe cards, 3 repair cards, 3 budget cards, 1 low-light welcome card, and a blank offer card tied with string. Calm. Each packet went home with someone who had already taught once at the cottage. Short pause. Matter of fact. The rule was simple. Calm. Use it with 2 or 3 people, not a crowd. Calm. Keep the food repeatable. Calm. Write down what changed. Calm. Bring 1 improved card back. Calm. Lottie approved because the packets kept the supper from becoming a place people admired instead of copied. Short pause. Happy. Biscuit disapproved of packets only because they did not smell like soup. Happy. He tried to improve one by sitting on it during tying, and Mara added a paw print to the front by accident. Matter of fact. The first returned packet came from Victor's diner. Calm. He had used the kitchen tool card with 2 employees after closing, then rewrote the first instruction from check the edge to clean the tool first. Matter of fact. He said half the trouble was old onion and impatience. Short pause. Matter of fact. The second came from Celia's hardware store, where a screen patch lesson had turned into a shelf for repair questions. The third came from the library, where budget jars became envelope bookmarks for people who did not want glass containers at home. Short pause. Each returned card proved the old porch rule. An instruction becomes stronger when ordinary hands adapt it honestly. Pause. Tense. Mara worried that travel would dilute the cottage's spirit, but Lottie corrected her again. Matter of fact. Spirit was the wrong word, she said. Calm. Practice. Short pause. Calm. If the practice remained clear, the table could stretch across town without becoming vague. Matter of fact. Bring 1 question. Matter of fact. Take 1 instruction you can repeat. Matter of fact. Teach 1 thing within a month. Matter of fact. Keep the late light low. Short pause. Calm. Those rules could fit in a diner, a library, a hardware store, or a lakeside kitchen. The carved names were roots, not chains. Pause. That changed Mara's understanding of Ellis one more time. Calm. The late chair was not only for people arriving at the cottage after supper began. Matter of fact. It was for any person arriving late to a skill everyone else seemed to know already. Wistful cooking at 40. Wistful budgeting after years of guessing. Wistful fixing a hinge after paying others for every small repair. Wistful asking what a pantry should contain. Short pause. Calm. The Ellis role was to lower the light around that late arrival, wherever it happened, so the person could step in without feeling behind. Pause. Matter of fact. By the next autumn, the mudroom wall had become a small archive with removable panels, labeled sleeves, and a stool for Biscuit, who insisted on being present whenever paper moved. Calm Mara kept the original letters safe, but the new cards mattered just as much. They carried today's handwriting, today's prices, today's bus routes, today's stove quirks, today's courage. Calm on the anniversary of the first envelope, Mara placed a fresh blank card under each carved name. By the end of supper, every card held an offer. Short pause. The cottage was not running out of letters anymore. It was teaching people how to write them. Pause, matter of fact. Before winter closed the lake road early, Mara made one last change. Calm, she placed a small box beside the mudroom panel labeled letters to be useful later. Short pause, calm. The first new letter came from a woman who had learned to make soup from pantry odds and wanted to explain how she changed the recipe for a neighbor who worked late. Calm, the second, came from Victor, who wrote kitchen tool instructions in words anyone could follow. Calm, the third, came from Celia, who drew pictures of a screen patch because not everyone learned best from sentences. Pause, calm. Mara did not read every new letter aloud. Matter of fact, some were meant for one future person with the same question, not for the room. Calm, she filed them by use, not by author, and Biscuit watched each packet disappear into the wall with solemn importance, though the word on his face was probably snacks. Wistful, the cottage had begun as a place where old letters escaped into daylight. Now it was a place where new letters entered the wall on purpose, ready for the next cracked season, the next late arrival, the next person who needed a practical instruction more than a grand encouragement.